I'm going to be straight with you all because I need to get this out. And honestly, if I don't write this down, I'm going to lose it. 3 years. 3 years where I spent building a life with Valentina. And last Wednesday afternoon, she sent me a WhatsApp photo that made me realize every single suspicion I'd had for the past 6 months was absolutely justified. Let me back up because this gets wild and you need context. I'm 29, work in tech consulting, and I've been with Valentina since we were 26. We met through mutual friends at some birthday party, and honestly, she seemed perfect at first. Ambitious, funny, knew exactly what she wanted. We moved in together after about 8 months. Got engaged last year. My parents loved her. My brother Tobias, who's 32, loved her maybe a bit too much in retrospect, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the thing about Tobias. Growing up, he was always the golden child. Better at sports, more charismatic, had that easy confidence that made people gravitate toward him. I was the nerdy younger brother who spent weekends coding while he was out with friends. Our parents never said it outright, but you could tell they were prouder of him. He dropped out of college to start some business ventures that never really took off. Burned through money like crazy, but somehow he was still the favorite. Meanwhile, I graduated, got a solid job, actually built something stable. Last year, my grandfather passed away and left me $200K. Not Tobias, me. Because my grandfather told me once that I reminded him of himself, someone who planned and saved and thought about the future. That inheritance was supposed to be my retirement foundation. I put $60K into crypto because I'd been following the markets for years and had a strategy. The rest went into investment accounts and savings. I told Valentina about it because we were engaged and supposedly building a future together. She got so excited, started talking about our wedding, our future house, all these plans. About 6 months ago, things started feeling off. Valentina began spending more time with Tobias. They'd always gotten along fine, but suddenly she was texting him constantly. They had inside jokes. She'd mention hanging out with him when I was at work. When I brought it up, she told me I was being paranoid and possessive, that Tobias was like a brother to her too. That I should be happy they got along so well because it made family gatherings easier. But I'm not stupid. I noticed how she'd angle her phone away when texting. How she started dressing differently when she knew they'd be in the same place. How Tobias would make these little comments about how I was always working, never made time for fun, how Valentina deserved someone who could show her a good time. My parents just laughed it off like it was brotherly teasing. So, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I didn't confront anyone yet because I wanted to be sure. And honestly, I wanted to see exactly how far this would go. I changed my crypto wallet passwords, set up separate accounts they didn't know about, started moving money quietly. If something was happening, I wasn't going to be caught unprepared. 2 months ago, Valentina started talking about wanting to take a trip. She'd been stressed with work, needed a break, maybe Bali or Thailand, somewhere tropical. I said, sure. We could plan something for later in the year when I had time off. She got annoyed. Said I always put work first, that she wanted to feel alive and spontaneous for once. The argument went nowhere. 3 weeks ago, I came home early from a client meeting and found Tobias leaving our apartment. He had a key, said Valentina had called him to fix the bathroom sink because I was always too busy. The sink was fine. I'd literally checked it that morning. When I asked Valentina about it later, she got defensive. Said I was making something out of nothing, that I was being paranoid and controlling. And honestly, it was getting exhausting. Last Wednesday, I was in back-to-back meetings all morning. Around 2 p.m., my phone buzzed with a WhatsApp message from Valentina. It was a photo taken at an airport departure gate. Tobias had his arm wrapped around her waist. Both of them grinning at the camera. She was wearing the custom necklace I'd had made for her birthday last year. This delicate thing with her initial that cost me $2,000 because I wanted it to be special. The caption read, "Finally free. Off to Bali with a real man while you slave away at your boring job. By the way, checked your crypto wallet this morning and moved $60K to fund our Paradise Villa rental. Your grandfather's inheritance bought to buy us a Lamborghini rental for the week. P.S. I'm pregnant and it's his. Oh, and that retirement fund you keep talking about. We booked a private resort with it. Thanks for being such a reliable ATM. Have fun at work. I was in a conference room with 4 colleagues when I read it. Just sat there staring at my phone while someone droned on about quarterly projections. One of my coworkers asked if I was okay, and I said, yeah, just some personal stuff, and somehow got through the rest of the meeting without losing it completely. Here's what you need to understand. I wasn't shocked. Angry, absolutely furious, actually. But not shocked because I'd spent the past 6 months preparing for exactly this possibility. Those account passwords. I changed the crypto wallet she thought she accessed. I'd moved that money weeks ago into accounts she didn't know existed. Set up a dummy wallet with a small amount just to see if she'd try anything. She took the bait. That retirement fund she mentioned also moved. The money she thought they were spending was actually a small checking account I'd been funneling fake deposits into to make it look legitimate. Every single major asset I had was locked down tight in accounts only I could access. But they didn't know that yet. And that's where this gets interesting. I didn't respond to the message, didn't call, didn't text, nothing. I just smiled, saved the screenshot, and went back to work. Because here's the thing about Tobias and Valentina. They're impulsive, arrogant, and apparently not very bright when it comes to actually checking if money transfers went through before getting on a plane. By 5 p.m., my phone started buzzing. By 7 p.m., it was constant. By 10 p.m. Wednesday night, I had 134 unread messages and 52 missed calls. Want to know what happened? Let me tell you about the moment reality hit them and why my Thursday morning has been absolutely fascinating. But first, I need to mention something else because this is where the family dynamics get really messy and you'll understand why I'm about to do what I'm planning to do. My parents. My parents. When Tobias called them from the airport in hysterics because apparently the villa rental fell through and the Lamborghini company wanted immediate payment and Valentina was screaming at him, my mother's first call wasn't to ask what the hell they'd done. It was to ask why I wasn't helping my brother in his time of need. Yeah, let that sink in. Update 1. Okay, so the comments on Hidden Lie's last post were wild. And yeah, I'm reading all of them between dealing with this absolute circus. Someone said I should check if the pregnancy is even real. Way ahead of you. Someone else said, my family sounds toxic. Also correct. But let me tell you exactly how toxic. Because Thursday and Friday have been absolutely unhinged. So Wednesday night after that airport photo, my phone basically became a slot machine of notifications. I'm talking constant buzzing. I left it on my kitchen counter and just watched it light up while I ate leftover pizza. And honestly, it was therapeutic. Let me break down the message progression because it tells you everything about these people. First wave, Wednesday, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. was Valentina sending me paragraphs about how I never appreciated her, how Tobias made her feel alive, how she deserved better than someone who chose spreadsheets over spontaneity, real philosophical stuff about how I was emotionally unavailable. She'd been dying inside our relationship. She actually wrote that our engagement was a mistake and she'd only stayed because she felt sorry for me, that I was boring and predictable, and she needed passion. Second wave, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The tone shifted. The villa rental company wanted payment up front, and apparently my dummy checking account didn't have enough to cover it. The Lamborghini rental place was threatening to cancel. Suddenly, the messages were asking why the transfers weren't going through. Was there a problem with my bank? Could I check on it? Still trying to sound casual like we were on good terms. Third wave, 9 p.m. to midnight, full panic mode. Tobias started calling. Valentina started calling. My phone was getting hammered from both of them. The messages went from confused to angry to desperate. Valentina sent me 20 messages in a row asking what I did. Why wasn't the money there? This wasn't funny. They were stranded at the airport. Here's what apparently happened. And I pieced this together from the absolutely unhinged voice messages they left. They got to the airport early, super excited, took that photo specifically to hurt me because Valentina wanted me to know exactly what was happening. They checked in, went through security, sat at the gate for 2 hours feeling victorious, boarded the plane, sat on the plane for another hour during boarding. Then Valentina decided to confirm the villa booking on her phone and got an email saying payment had failed. She tried to call them, but they were literally about to take off, so she had to get off the plane. Tobias followed her. They tried to sort it at the airport, called the villa place, who said they'd been trying to reach them about the declined payment. Checked the Lamborghini rental, also declined. The absolute best part, they'd already paid for the flights, non-refundable tickets. So, they're standing in the international terminal watching their plane to Bali take off without them, and slowly realizing that none of the money they thought they'd stolen actually existed. Thursday morning at 6 a.m., my mother called, not to check if I was okay after my fiancé and brother betrayed me. No, to tell me that Tobias was crying on the phone to her, that there had been some horrible mix-up with bank accounts and I needed to fix it immediately because he and Valentina were stuck at the airport with no way to get to Bali and this was clearly just a technical error that I needed to resolve. I answered the phone because honestly, I'd been waiting for this. Told her there was no mix-up, that Valentina had sent me a photo telling me she was stealing my money to run away with Tobias, that she was pregnant with his baby, and that they'd both betrayed me in the most calculated way possible, that they tried to access my accounts, but I'd moved everything weeks ago because I'm not stupid. My mother's response, she said I was overreacting, that relationships have problems and I shouldn't be so vindictive, that Tobias made a mistake, but he's family and I'm being cruel by not helping him. She actually said that Valentina probably didn't mean those things in the photo, that she was just upset and acting out and I should be the bigger person. I hung up on her. My father called me an hour later with a different approach. Tried the reasonable dad voice. Said that whatever happened between Valentina and Tobias was wrong. But leaving them stranded in an airport was excessive. That Tobias had always struggled and needed support, not punishment. That I was lucky to have inherited money from grandfather and should share it with family when they needed help. He kept saying that this was about being a good brother, about family loyalty, about not holding grudges. I told him that Tobias and Valentina literally tried to steal $60K from me and use my grandfather's inheritance to fund their affair vacation. That the only reason they were stuck was because they'd already spent their own money on flights before confirming the stolen money was accessible. That their entire plan was to humiliate me and leave me financially destroyed, and I'd simply protected myself. Dad got quiet and then said I was being calculating and cold. That this wasn't how he raised me. That family forgives. I hung up on him. By Thursday afternoon, the messages from Valentina changed again. She was furious. Told me I'd sabotaged their trip on purpose, that I'd set them up, that I was a manipulative psycho who'd been planning this. She demanded I send them money immediately for a hotel because they couldn't afford to stay anywhere. Said it was my fault they were in this position and I owed them. Tobias sent me a long message about how I'd always been jealous of him. How I couldn't stand that Valentina chose him. How I was being petty and vindictive because I'd always been the unsuccessful brother who needed to prove something. He said grandfather left me that money out of pity, not respect. That everyone in the family knew I was the disappointment. I didn't respond to any of it. Friday morning, Valentina's mother, Lorraine, called me. And here's where this gets into like a whole new level of mess because apparently Valentina had been telling her family a completely different story about our relationship for months. Lorraine was absolutely screaming at me on the phone. Told me that Valentina had been confiding in her about how controlling and financially abusive I was. That I monitored all her spending, that I'd been isolating her from friends, that she'd been planning to leave me for weeks and I'd figured it out and was now punishing her by cutting off her access to money. She said Valentina was pregnant and stranded and I was a monster for abandoning her. I was at my desk at work when this call came through. Stepped into an empty conference room and let Lorraine vent for a solid 5 minutes. When she finally stopped to breathe, I asked her if Valentina had mentioned that she'd sent me a photo from the airport bragging about stealing my inheritance to vacation with my brother. If she'd mentioned that the pregnancy was with Tobias, not me. If she'd mentioned that I'd caught them having an affair and this whole trip was them running away together with stolen money. Silence. Then Lorraine said I was lying, that Valentina would never do that I was making up stories to justify my abuse. She hung up on me. 20 minutes later, Valentina's sister, Gwendolyn, called. Different approach, tried to be sympathetic and understanding. Said that relationships are complicated and maybe Valentina had made some mistakes, but I was being extreme. That she'd talked to Valentina, who'd admitted things with Tobias had gotten complicated, but they'd been planning to talk to me honestly, and I'd overreacted by locking them out of accounts. That Valentina was sorry about the photo, that she'd been emotional and said things she didn't mean. I asked Gwendalyn if Valentina had told her exactly what was in that photo caption. Gwendalyn got defensive, said it didn't matter what Valentina said in a moment of anger, that actions were what counted, and my actions were abandoning a pregnant woman in an airport. So, I sent Gwendalyn the screenshot, the full photo with the full caption about stealing my crypto, my inheritance, the retirement fund, the pregnancy with Tobias calling me an ATM. Gwendalyn stopped responding. Here's the new problem, and honestly, I should have seen this coming. Our apartment. Valentina and I signed a joint lease. Both our names on it. All the utilities in both names. She has a key. Her stuff is there. Friday afternoon, I got a message from Tobias saying they'd scraped together enough money for flights back home, landing Sunday morning. And when they got back, we were going to sit down and talk like adults about dividing assets and ending this situation fairly. That Valentina had rights to the apartment and her belongings, and I couldn't just lock her out. The thing is, he's technically right. I can't just change the locks without going through proper legal channels. And if they come back Sunday, Valentina has every right to enter that apartment. Which creates a really interesting problem because I've spent the last 2 days preparing for exactly this scenario. And trust me, when they walk into that apartment Sunday morning, they're going to realize that this situation is far from over. But there's something else, something I haven't mentioned yet because it's been developing in the background. And honestly, it's about to make everything exponentially more complicated. My job, I work in tech consulting, right? Well, Tobias works freelance in tech sales. Completely different companies, different sectors, but we have professional overlap, some mutual connections through the industry. And Thursday afternoon, I found out through a former colleague that Tobias has been telling people in our professional network a very different version of events. According to Tobias's story that's making the rounds, I've had a mental health crisis. I'm unstable and paranoid. I've become obsessed with the idea that he and Valentina are having an affair when they're just friends. I've locked them out of shared accounts in a delusional episode, and he's trying to help Valentina escape an increasingly dangerous situation, and people are believing him because Tobias is charismatic and well-liked, and I'm the quiet, nerdy brother who keeps to himself. This is about to affect my professional reputation, my job, my entire career that I've actually built while Tobias was coasting on charm and failed business ventures. Sunday morning, they land and I have about 48 hours to decide exactly how I'm going to handle the moment they walk back into that apartment and realize I've been 10 steps ahead this entire time. Update 2. Alright, so Sunday happened and I'm writing this Monday night because the last 36 hours have been absolutely insane and I need to process what's going on before my head explodes. Also, shout out to everyone who said my family is enabling Tobias. You were painfully right and it gets so much worse. Let me start with Sunday morning because the apartment confrontation was honestly just the beginning of this mess. They landed at 9 a.m. I knew this because Tobias sent me their flight details Saturday night with a message saying they'd be at the apartment by 11 o'clock and we needed to have a mature conversation about moving forward. That I'd had my tantrum and now it was time to handle this like adults. The entitlement in that message was unreal. I spent Saturday moving everything of value that was mine out of the apartment. My laptop, important documents, anything I actually cared about. Took it to a storage unit I'd rented. Not because I was scared they'd destroy stuff, but because I wanted zero complications about what belongs to who. The apartment itself wasn't the battleground I cared about. Sunday at 10:45 a.m., I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of our apartment complex when I saw them pull up in an Uber. They looked exhausted and angry. Valentina was wearing the same outfit from the airport photo. They went inside. I gave them 15 minutes. Wanted them to settle in, look around, start feeling comfortable. Then I walked in. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it Friday night. Clean, normal, nothing dramatic. Valentina was in the bedroom. Tobias was sitting on the couch looking at his phone. When I walked in, Tobias stood up immediately and started talking. He told me we needed to discuss this situation rationally, that what happened between him and Valentina was complicated, but they hadn't meant to hurt me this way. That the airport photo was a mistake. Valentina had been emotional and lashed out, but they wanted to make things right. He said they'd been talking on the flight back and realized they'd handled everything wrong. I just stood there. Let him talk because I wanted to hear exactly how they were going to try to spin this. Valentina came out of the bedroom, and the second she saw me, her entire demeanor changed. She started yelling about how I'd humiliated them, stranded them, made them look like idiots in front of the rental companies and the airline, that I'd sabotaged their trip on purpose because I'm a controlling, vindictive person who can't handle losing. She said the things she wrote in that photo caption were true, that I am boring and emotionally unavailable, and she's not sorry for finding happiness with someone who actually knows how to live. Here's where it got interesting. I asked Valentina directly about the pregnancy. Is she actually pregnant, or was that just part of the message meant to hurt me? She hesitated, looked at Tobias, then said yes, she's pregnant about 6 weeks. And yes, it's Tobias's baby because they'd been together since March. We got engaged in February. She'd been sleeping with my brother for 7 months and planning this whole thing while wearing my engagement ring. Tobias jumped in and said they hadn't planned for this to happen, that feelings developed naturally, that he and Valentina connected on a level that she and I never had, that I was always working and distant, and Valentina deserved someone present. He actually said that their relationship was real and meaningful, and I should respect that instead of trying to ruin it. I asked them about the money, about trying to access my accounts, about the whole plan to steal my inheritance. Valentina got defensive and said it wasn't stealing because we were engaged and shared finances. That she had as much right to that money as I did since we were building a life together. That I'd always been secretive about money and controlling about spending. And she was tired of asking permission for everything. This was completely false. By the way, we'd never combined finances. We split rent and utilities but kept separate accounts. I told her about the inheritance because I thought we were building a future together, not because we had joint access to anything. Tobias said I'd set them up by moving the money and creating fake accounts, that I'd been planning to humiliate them, and that made me just as bad as what they'd done. He kept saying I'd orchestrated this whole situation to make them look bad. We went in circles for almost 2 hours, Valentina crying and saying I never loved her properly. Tobias saying I'd always been jealous of his relationship skills. Both of them insisting that while the airport photo was wrong, my response was equally wrong and we all needed to move past this. I finally asked what they wanted. What was the actual point of this conversation? Valentina said she wanted to stay in the apartment until the end of the lease in 4 months. That legally she had the right because her name was on it. She said she'd pay her half of rent and I could stay or leave, but she wasn't being forced out of her home. She also said she wanted her engagement ring back because it belonged to her and I'd given it as a gift. Tobias said he'd be staying with her, that they were together now, and I needed to accept that. He said if I had a problem with it, I could be the one to move out. The absolute audacity of these people. Here's what I told them. Valentina could stay in the apartment until the lease ended because legally I couldn't force her out. But I was moving my name off the utilities immediately. She'd be responsible for getting them put in her name and paying for everything. I was not paying a single additional dollar for an apartment I wasn't living in. The engagement ring was a conditional gift based on marriage. And since she'd cheated and ended the relationship, I wanted it back. If she didn't return it, I'd pursue it legally. Valentina started screaming about how I was abandoning her while pregnant, how I was proving I never cared about her. Tobias said I was being petty about the ring and utilities. That this was exactly the kind of calculated, controlling behavior that drove Valentina away. I left, packed a bag that night, and stayed with a friend from work. Monday morning, so today is when everything escalated into a completely different dimension. I got to work at 8 a.m. and my manager, Omar, asked to speak with me privately. Apparently, over the weekend, someone had sent HR an anonymous complaint about me. The complaint stated that I'd been exhibiting unstable behavior, making paranoid accusations about colleagues, and had become volatile and unpredictable. It suggested I might be a risk to myself and others, and recommended the company look into my mental state. The complaint was anonymous, but came with specific details about my work performance and projects that only someone familiar with my role would know. HR wanted to have a conversation with me about my well-being and whether I needed any support or time off. I immediately knew this was Tobias. He doesn't work for my company, but he has enough connections in tech to know who to contact and what to say to cause maximum damage. I spent an hour in HR explaining the actual situation. Showed them the WhatsApp photo from Valentina. Explained that my brother and fiancé had tried to steal from me and were now running a character assassination campaign because I'd protected my assets. HR was sympathetic, but said they had to take the complaint seriously and would be monitoring the situation. Omar pulled me aside after and said he believed me, but I needed to be careful. That perception matters in our industry, and if people start thinking I'm unstable, it will follow me regardless of truth. He said to document everything and keep my head down professionally. Here's the thing that's making me absolutely furious. Tobias has always done this. Growing up, whenever he got in trouble, he'd flip the narrative and make himself the victim. Got caught cheating on a test. The teacher had it out for him. Got fired from a job. The boss was intimidated by his skills. Failed at business ventures. The market wasn't ready for his ideas. And our parents always believed him because he knew how to tell a story that made him sympathetic. Now he's doing it professionally and it's working. I checked LinkedIn and he'd posted some vague story about supporting a family member through a difficult mental health crisis and hoping they get the help they need. Comments from mutual connections offering support and asking if they could help. He's building a public narrative that I'm the unstable one. Monday afternoon, my father called me, not to check on me, but to tell me that he and my mother had invited Tobias and Valentina to stay with them temporarily. That Valentina needs support during her pregnancy, and Tobias needs somewhere stable while they figure things out. That as parents, they couldn't turn their back on their son, even if they didn't agree with his choices. I asked him if he understood what they'd done, if he grasped that they'd literally tried to steal from me and were now trying to destroy my professional reputation. Dad said that family is complicated and I was being too black and white about this. That yes, Tobias made mistakes, but I'd responded by humiliating them and refusing to help. That my rigidity and need for revenge was making everything worse. He said I was damaging the family by refusing to forgive. I told him I wasn't interested in having a relationship with any of them right now and hung up. An hour later, my mother sent me a long text about how disappointed she was. That she'd raised me to be compassionate and forgiving, not cold and calculating. That Valentina was pregnant and scared and needed support, not abandonment. That Tobias was struggling and I was making it worse by freezing him out. She said I was choosing money over family, and she didn't recognize this version of me. Let me be clear about something. I don't care about the money they tried to steal beyond the principle of it. What I care about is that they planned this. They coordinated for months. They deliberately hurt me and thought they'd get away with it because they assumed I was too trusting or stupid to protect myself. And now that their plan failed, they're trying to make me the villain. The thing that's keeping me up tonight is realizing that Tobias isn't done. He's going to keep pushing this narrative professionally until it impacts my career. And with my parents supporting them, providing them housing and emotional backup, they have the resources to keep this going. The apartment situation is unsustainable. Valentina has legal right to be there, but no way to actually pay for utilities or furniture or anything beyond her half of rent. Tobias doesn't have steady income. They're dependent on my parents financially, which means my parents now have leverage over me to try to force reconciliation. I talked to a lawyer today about the engagement ring and the lease situation. Got some information that's going to be useful for what I'm planning next. Because if they think this is over, if they think I'm just going to move on and let them rewrite history, they're absolutely wrong. But there's something else I found out today that changes everything. And I need advice on how to handle it because it involves my parents in a way I didn't expect. And honestly, I'm not sure what the right move is here. Final update. So, it's been 3 weeks since Hidden Lies' last update, and I'm finally in a position to write this all out because the dust has settled enough that I can see exactly how this played out. Fair warning, this gets intense and involves my parents in ways I didn't expect. But honestly, they made their choices. Let me start with the thing I mentioned at the end of Hidden Lies' last post. The thing involving my parents that changed everything. Tuesday, after that disaster Sunday confrontation, I was going through paperwork I'd grabbed from the apartment and found some old financial documents from when Tobias and I were younger. Stuff my parents had kept for us. Tax returns, loan applications, random financial records. I was looking for anything that might be useful legally. That's when I found loan documents from 3 years ago. Tobias had taken out a $35,000 personal loan to start one of his failed business ventures. My parents had co-signed it. The business crashed within 8 months and Tobias defaulted on the payments. My parents had been making the monthly payments ever since to protect their credit. $35,000 at whatever interest rate they'd agreed to. They'd been bleeding money for 3 years covering his mess. But here's the part that made me absolutely furious. That same year, I'd asked my parents for help with a down payment on a condo, just $10,000 as a loan, that I'd pay back. They told me they couldn't afford it, that money was tight, that I should save up on my own because I was responsible and capable. Meanwhile, they'd co-signed $35,000 for Tobias and were secretly covering his debt. I confronted my father about it Wednesday morning, called him and asked directly why they'd never mentioned covering Tobias's loan. Why they told me they had no money to help me when they were paying hundreds of dollars a month for his failure. Dad got defensive immediately. Said that Tobias needed help and I didn't. That I was financially stable and Tobias was struggling, and that's what parents do. They support the child who needs it most. He said they didn't tell me because they knew I'd be upset and judgmental. That I'd never understood Tobias's creative entrepreneurial spirit. I told him I was done. Done with the favoritism. Done with them enabling Tobias. Done with being told I was cruel for not supporting someone who'd betrayed me while they literally paid his debts and housed him. I said if they wanted to keep funding Tobias's life while he tried to destroy mine professionally, that was their choice. But I wanted nothing to do with any of them. My father said I was being dramatic, that I was choosing to destroy the family over money and pride. That when I calmed down, I'd realize family is forever and these grudges were pointless. I hung up and made a decision right then about exactly how far I was willing to push this. Thursday, I went back to the lawyer I'd consulted about the engagement ring. We had a much longer conversation about all my options regarding the apartment lease, Valentina's claims to shared assets, and what I could legally do to protect myself while applying maximum pressure. The lawyer laid out a strategy that was aggressive but completely legal. First, the engagement ring. I sent Valentina a formal legal demand for its return within 7 days. The ring was worth about $8,000 and under state law, an engagement ring is a conditional gift. The condition is marriage. Since she'd broken the engagement by cheating, the ring legally belonged to me. If she didn't return it, I'd file a civil claim. Second, the apartment. I sent formal written notice to the landlord and Valentina that I was exercising my right to terminate my portion of the lease early by paying the 2-month penalty. This meant Valentina had 2 options. Take over the full lease herself or also pay the penalty to break it. She couldn't afford to do either. The landlord would require proof of income to approve her taking over the lease alone, and her salary wasn't enough to cover the full rent. Third, I filed to have all utilities disconnected from my name effective immediately. Valentina would need to set them up herself, which requires deposits and credit checks. Given that she'd been living off shared expenses with me, she didn't have the cash reserves to cover multiple utility deposits. The response was immediate and exactly what I expected. Friday morning, Valentina was blowing up my phone. She was screaming about how I was making her homeless, how I was abandoning her while pregnant, how this was financial abuse. She said I was deliberately trying to ruin her life because I couldn't handle that she'd chosen Tobias, that I was a vindictive psycho who was showing his true colors. I didn't respond. Let her keep calling. Tobias sent me a long message about how my actions were proving everything he'd been saying about me professionally, that I was unstable and controlling, and this was evidence of a pattern. He said he was documenting everything I was doing and would use it to prove to our professional network that he'd been right about my mental state. Still didn't respond. My mother called me crying, begging me to reconsider, saying that Valentina had nowhere to go, that I was being heartless, that she was pregnant and needed stability. I asked my mother why she thought any of this was my responsibility after what they'd done. Mom said that regardless of what happened between us, abandoning someone pregnant was wrong, that I was better than this. I asked her if Valentina and Tobias could move in with her and Dad long-term. If they were so concerned about Valentina's housing, they could provide it. Mom went quiet, then said their house wasn't big enough for 3 extra people long-term. That it was a temporary arrangement. So, I pointed out that Valentina was my temporary arrangement that became long-term. And now that it was over, she needed to figure out her own housing. That if Mom and Dad wanted to support Tobias's choices, they could support the consequences, too. Mom said I was being cruel and selfish. That I was punishing Valentina for Tobias's actions. I hung up. Here's what actually happened over the next week. And this is where my planning paid off in ways they never saw coming. Valentina couldn't take over the lease. The landlord required proof of income at 3 times the monthly rent. Her salary wasn't enough. Tobias offered to be added to the lease as a co-signer, but he had no steady employment and terrible credit from his failed ventures. The landlord rejected it. Valentina couldn't pay the early termination penalty to break the lease. Neither could Tobias. They tried to get my parents to cover it, but the penalty was $4,800, and my parents said they couldn't afford it while already covering Tobias's loan payments and housing them temporarily. The utilities got shut off after I disconnected my name. Valentina tried to get them turned on in her name, but couldn't afford the combined deposits. The apartment had no electricity or water for 4 days before the landlord got involved and told her she was violating the lease terms. By the following Wednesday, Valentina was forced to abandon the apartment. She moved back in with her mother, Lorraine. Tobias followed her there. All her furniture, all the stuff we'd accumulated together, she had to figure out what to do with. Most of it ended up sold cheap or left for the landlord to deal with because she couldn't afford movers. The landlord is now pursuing both of us for the early termination penalty, plus damages for the abandoned property. I'm paying my portion because I can afford it and want this completely resolved. Valentina can't pay hers. It's going to collections and destroying her credit. The engagement ring situation got even better. Valentina refused to return it, claiming it was a gift with no conditions. I filed the civil claim like I'd warned. She had to hire a lawyer she couldn't afford to defend it. The lawyer looked at the case, looked at the evidence, including the WhatsApp photo where she admitted to the affair, and told her she had no case. She returned the ring last week to avoid a court judgment against her. Now, here's where the professional reputation thing gets interesting. And honestly, this is the part I'm most proud of. Tobias had been spreading his story through our professional network, painting me as unstable and himself as the concerned brother trying to help. It was working. People who'd known me professionally for years were starting to look at me differently. So, I did what Tobias never expected. I directly addressed it. I reached out to 3 of our most prominent mutual connections, people who are well respected in our tech industry circle. I met with each of them separately and told them the complete factual story. Showed them the WhatsApp photo from the airport with Valentina's caption about stealing my money. Showed them the messages about trying to access my accounts. Explained that Tobias and Valentina had planned to steal my inheritance. And when I'd protected my assets, they'd started a smear campaign. I didn't frame it emotionally. Didn't badmouth Tobias beyond the facts. Just laid out what happened chronologically with evidence and let them draw their own conclusions. All 3 of them were shocked. One of them had actually been considering hiring Tobias for a contract position. He immediately withdrew the offer. Another one was in the same professional group as Tobias and started asking around about other situations where Tobias had misrepresented facts. Turns out this wasn't the first time Tobias had spun a narrative that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Within a week, the story made its way through our network, not through gossip or drama, but through professional channels where facts matter. Tobias's LinkedIn post about supporting a family member through a mental health crisis started getting very different responses. People asking for more details, people pointing out inconsistencies. Tobias tried to control the narrative, but the more he talked, the more people asked questions he couldn't answer without admitting what he'd actually done. His professional reputation took a hit he didn't see coming because he'd assumed no one would fact-check his story. The contract work he'd been living on started drying up. People in tech talk and word got around that Tobias was unreliable and ethically questionable. He's been struggling to find work for the past 2 weeks. Which brings us to the current situation and why everything has completely fallen apart for them in ways they still don't fully understand. Valentina is living with her mother, Lorraine, who is absolutely furious about the entire situation. Turns out Lorraine didn't know about the affair until after the airport disaster. Valentina had been lying to her family about why the relationship ended. When the full story came out, including the WhatsApp photo and the attempted theft, Lorraine was horrified. Lorraine and Valentina have been fighting constantly. Lorraine told her she was disappointed and disgusted by her choices, that she'd raised her better than to cheat and steal. Valentina keeps defending herself by saying I was emotionally neglectful, and she deserves happiness. But even her own mother isn't buying it anymore. Tobias is still staying there too, which is creating massive tension because Lorraine never agreed to house him long-term. He has nowhere else to go because my parents' temporary housing offer ended after 2 weeks. They couldn't sustain 3 extra people in their house and the constant conflict that came with it. My parents are still making Tobias's loan payments because their credit is tied to it, but they've started resenting him for it. My mother called me last week, not to apologize, but to complain about how expensive it is to support Tobias and how he doesn't appreciate their sacrifices. I pointed out that this was exactly what they'd been doing for 3 years, and now they were actually seeing the consequences of enabling him. Mom got upset and said I was being vindictive. I reminded her that she'd told me I was being cruel for not helping Tobias, and now she understood why I refused. She hung up on me. The pregnancy situation has added another layer of chaos because Valentina is now about 12 weeks along and reality is setting in. She can't afford to raise a baby. Tobias has no steady income. They're living in her mother's house with no plan. Lorraine has been pressuring them to get married and figure out their lives. But Tobias keeps stalling because he's realizing that being tied to Valentina long-term means being tied to all these consequences permanently. Last week, Gwendolyn, Valentina's sister, sent me a message apologizing. Said she'd been wrong to defend Valentina, that she'd seen the full picture now and was horrified by what they'd done. She said Valentina keeps playing the victim, but everyone in their family is tired of it. I thanked her for reaching out, but told her I wasn't interested in updates about Valentina's life. Yesterday, Tobias tried one more time, sent me a long message about how we're brothers and family should forgive. That he'd made mistakes, but I'd made it impossible for him to recover. That my actions had destroyed his professional reputation and made it impossible for him to support Valentina and their baby. That I needed to let go of my anger and help him rebuild. I finally responded, told him that he'd spent his entire life coasting on charm and manipulation while I worked hard and built stability. That he'd always assumed he could take what was mine because our parents had taught him that his needs mattered more than my boundaries. That he'd tried to steal from me, humiliate me, and destroy my reputation. And the only reason he was suffering now was because his plan failed. That I didn't owe him forgiveness or help or anything else. That the consequences he was facing were entirely his own creation. Tobias responded that I'd always been jealous of him and this was proof that I was bitter and small and everyone in the family knew it, that he'd made mistakes, but I was choosing to be a monster about it. I blocked him after that. Blocked my parents blocked Valentina. I'm done with all of them. The apartment is fully resolved. I've paid my portion of everything. The engagement ring is back in my possession, and I sold it last week. My professional reputation is intact and actually stronger because the people who matter saw how I handled a crisis with facts and evidence instead of emotion. My finances are exactly where I planned them to be. Tobias and Valentina are living in her mother's house with no money, no plan, a baby coming, and everyone around them growing tired of their excuses. My parents are still covering Tobias's debt and realizing that enabling him means permanent financial burden. Their golden child isn't so golden anymore when they're the ones paying for his choices. I'm not going to pretend this didn't hurt. 3 years with Valentina, my whole family turned toxic. All of it gone. But I spent months preparing for this exact scenario, and every single move I made was calculated. They tried to destroy me and instead destroyed themselves. And honestly, I'm completely fine with how this turned out. They wanted me to be the villain in their story so badly that they never considered I might actually be the one writing the ending.